Hey everyone, my name is Elbian, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about my composition predictions for the MDI that's happening in a week from today. So these will be for season 1 of 2021, which of course is on like the 9.0.2 patch. Before we get started though, I just want to talk a little bit about me, who I am, because I imagine that this is a relatively new audience for me. I am a professional Overwatch coach, actually. I spent the last couple of years, actually, but in 2020 with British Hurricane and EU Contenders, we won 7 out of 8 tournaments. We're the reigning EU Gauntlet champions. So I've been doing the esports thing for a little while, and I'm currently the rank 22 Mistweaver in the world, and in season 3 and season 4 of BFA, I peaked in like the top 230, I believe it was, for Holy Paladins in North America. Not to say that I'm like the sickest WoW player in the world or anything. It's just to say that I'm not completely new to WoW, and I've been a fan of the MDI ever since like the end of Legion, and I think it's a really underappreciated esport, both within the WoW community. I think it's underappreciated compared to AWC and the Race to World First, and I think it's an underappreciated. I think WoW esports as a whole are underappreciated within the esports community. So this year, for at least season 1 of the MDI of 2021, I'm definitely planning on making some content about it because I just think it's really neat, and I like it a lot, and this is something I kind of want to do. So, all right, so we'll go ahead and get into it. First off, we have to talk about what makes a spec, quote, MDI worthy. The requirements for being an MDI spec are very different than the requirements for being a like live key pushing spec, and we've seen that across pretty much all of the MDIs, right? Besides maybe the first MDI in Legion. So utility is obviously a useful thing, but it's sort of up to a point is utility useful, right? The utility needs to actually enable you to do something new within the dungeon, right? So a great example of this right now is for like a melee spec between rogues with Shroud of Concealment or Windwalker Monks with Leg Sweep, where currently invis skips are not as valuable as they were in BFA dungeons. The dungeon design is just a little bit different, right? You don't need invis as often, as well as in an MDI setting, everyone can be Night Elf because you can sort of just pick whatever race you want to be. And also invis pots currently are less punishing to use than previous because you lose out on less damage potions over the course of a dungeon. So Shroud of Concealment doesn't necessarily enable more things than Leg Sweep does, where Leg Sweep allows you to pull bigger and give your tank that, few seconds of just not getting hit and lets your healers and tank recover and save CDs for later in the pull, for example, right? So that's what we mean where not all utility is necessarily super important utility at all times, right? So utility always has to kind of be taken into context. There's a lot about being tanky enough, right? And essentially what this means is you just need to be able to not get completely one-shot by some mechanic, but you don't necessarily need to be able to not get one shot by a mechanic on like a plus 22 key, right? And this is where the keystone level of the MDI really comes into play, where if the keystone level is, for example, like a 2021, which it won't be, but if it's that high, specs that are tankier are going to be more valuable because it's actually going to be harder for you to survive everything. But if the keystone's, again, it won't be, but if the keystone's a plus 2, then tankiness is just not a factor, right? And we saw this at the end of BFA with Corruption, right? Where when pushing live keys, pushing these, 2930s at the end of BFA, tanks were running pure versatility gear, right? But in the MDI, they were running Twilight Devastation because they just didn't need the extra survivability, right? And we also, in the MDI, we didn't see verse stacking classes outside of the healers, really, right? And for the DPS, we saw Hunters instead of, Havocs or Outlaw Rogues that could stack verse and just tank through everything, right? So, and this is something new, actually, for Shadowlands. What does the spec fill the right covenant that you need for a dungeon, right? This is new for Shadowlands. We've never really had to think about this before. And in some dungeons, it's going to be more impactful than others, right? Generally speaking, Plaguefall, the Necrolord bonus is a little bit less impactful than even the Necrolord bonus in Theater of Pain with the 10% versatility. But like especially like Halls of Atonement, the Loyal Stillborns are a huge deal. In like Necrotic Wake, the Orbs from the Goliaths are also a huge deal. They really make pulls easier. So making sure sometimes a spec will come into a dungeon just because it's the right covenant, and if it fills that gap that the comp needs to just have that covenant bonuses, which that's a whole other topic. I don't think they should exist, but that's another thing. However, at the end of the day, damage is the most important thing for everyone in the MDI, because at the end of the day, winning a dungeon in the MDI really comes down to clearing the dungeon faster, and you can clear the dungeon faster by killing stuff faster. And generally speaking, AoE damage is more important than single target damage. It's been very rare over the history of the MDI, especially think about BFA's MDI, where you're not pulling stuff into bosses or trying to avoid hitting only one thing at a time. And that's generally speaking, most specs in the game do more damage on more targets than they do on one target. And it's more efficient use of your time to be dealing with trash while dealing with a boss. So as a general rule, AoE damage is more important than single target damage, and you'll see that reflected in a lot of the specs that get chosen, right? So getting into actual specs, we'll start with tanks, which I think are probably the least controversial pick here, and get down to maybe what I think might be the most controversial spec I'm going to choose for this. But I think you really only have one option. I think Vengeance Demon Hunter is really the only tank option that you're going to see played in the MDI in Season 1 of 2021. They were fringe meta in BFA, and they were picked for their mob control. So we saw them get played a couple of times in stuff like Siege of Borealis or Toldagor with the cannons, and in Siege, obviously, with the spotters, just trying to group the mobs up and put them in one spot. So we see stuff like Sigil of Chains, which is the yellow one, Sigil of Silence with the blue one, and Sigil of Misery, I believe, is the purple one. But basically, it's like pull everything in, silence everything, fear everything. They just have a lot of AoE mob control. So really what changed for Vengeance Demon Hunter from BFA to now going into Shadowlands is that they just have a higher uptime on defensives. Demonic as a talent, which replaced Gluttony as an old talent with Fell Devastation becoming baseline, basically means that they have higher uptime on meta, which is that middle icon. And higher uptime on Metamorphosis means that they're just, harder to kill. During meta, they have Vengeance Demon Hunters have absurd amounts of armor. They have crazy high health pools. It's very, very difficult for them to die during meta. And having Demonic instead of Gluttony means that they get to control when they enter meta for short periods of time, rather than being sort of RNG proc based. So this gives the Vengeance Demon Hunter players just a lot of control over what's going on. And then also there's now the Fiery Brand build, where Fiery Brand is instead of being a one-time cast for like 10 seconds every minute, it's being cast every like 30 seconds, I believe, and it spreads in AoE. So the uptime on Fiery Brand is very, very high at the moment, and that, of course, is a 40% damage reduction to every target marked with it. And when you're able to spread that to multiple mobs or just have it up on a boss, it means that their downtimes between defensives are much lower, so they are much tankier than they were in BFA. Another upside is that they're Kyrian, but most tank specs are Kyrian, but they're Kyrian, and File is very useful in a tank. Clear whatever poison disease on them, but it also clears stuff like necrotic, like Grievous. So it makes certain affixes much easier as well. But really the main thing that you're picking, not the main thing, but one of the things that Vengeance Demon Hunter has always done very well is damage. They have really good damage on their own and through adding Chaos Brand to the group, which of course makes all mobs take 5% more magic damage. They're pretty heavily AoE focused in damage. The Kyrian ability, Elysian Decree, on top of their other sigils, is just absurd amounts of AoE burst damage, which is also really strong for snapping threat to them, which then lets them kite. And like I have written down, they're very, very mobile. Infernal Strike lets them run around very quickly. It's both lets them gather packs together very quickly because they can jump from pack to pack, and it also lets them kite very effectively. And especially with how much mob control they have on their own, as well as AoE damage with Elysian Decree and like Sigil of Flame and stuff like that, they can hold aggro while running away quite well. So the end result being they have really high mob control, which is very valuable for the MDI. They're tankier than most of the other tank specs, which is also valuable for the MDI. And they do much more AoE damage than a lot of the tank specs. There's like a slight fringe chance that like maybe Prot Paladin is also really good for the MDI because they have similar strengths where they have really good AoE damage with Divine Toll, and they're tanky enough for low key levels, but I just don't think we're going to see it. I think most of the MDI tanks who are playing Vengeance Demon Hunter on live keys right now are just going to stick with Vengeance, and I don't blame them for that. I think Vengeance is a really good pick. So moving on to the DPS, we'll start off with Marksmanship Hunter, which I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, really. Marksmanship Hunter is a Swiss Army knife spec. They have literally all of the utility. Misdirects to keep aggro while your tank is kiting is really valuable, actually, in the current state where tanks have to kite a lot, especially in these big pulls. Even though it's the MDI, tanks are still going to have to kite a little bit. There's still just a lot of really scary mobs that you just don't really want to be getting hit by during the gaps in your Vengeance Demon Hunter's defensives. So misdirects while they have to kite is really valuable. Tranquilizing Shot, just to soothe, deal with the raging affix. There are some mobs like before entering the gnome area in the other side, those two big skeletons, tranquilizing shot on them to just get rid of that rage is super valuable. There's like the ghouls in Sanguine Depths that removing their enrage is also really powerful. And then binding shot is extremely strong for helping your tank kite, right? Just locking everything down in one area and then letting your tank, drop Sigil of Flame or whatever to do damage and keep up threat on them is very valuable. But I haven't even covered all the utility they have. I'm forgetting like Freezing Trap, Tar Trap, the knockback and like Blasting Shot. Marksmanship Hunter, if it's a piece of utility, they have it, right? And that's just sort of hunters in general. Hunters are really, truly are a Swiss Army knife spec. But they also bring extremely strong burst damage, both in AoE and single target. So the blue icon is Wild Spirits, which is the Night Fae ability, and then the red icon is Volley. And basically these two work in tandem where you drop the Wild Spirits, which is a large area that things take damage inside of. And when you deal damage to things inside of that Wild Spirits hits 5 targets within there for some damage. And Volley does damage to things within an area. And then it also picks up a buff called Trick Shots, which means that your spells hit multiple targets in there. And it's this compounding factor where you just do absurd amounts of AoE damage while these two things are up. And they're pretty short cooldowns. Volley's a 45-second cooldown. Wild Spirits is a 2-minute cooldown. Very easy to drop on a big pack and just like nuke. And as well as they also have double tap, I believe. Maybe it's double shot, which puts a buff on either their aim shots or their rapid fire. So 2 of their single target spells. This is on a 1-minute cooldown. So they have really strong both sort of AoE and single target damage. They have a little bit of issue dealing damage between their cooldowns, but their cooldowns are pretty short. So you can really sort of just cycle them through, and there's not too many gaps within it. And overall, their damage is very, very strong. And again, they sort of hit this tanky enough line, right? Where they have Aspect of the Turtle, which is like a quasi-immunity for a lot of stuff, and also just a huge damage reduction. Survival of the Fittest is a new thing that they have, and it's just a 20% DR. And Exhilaration is a 30% self-heal, a 30% of their maximum health self-heal. The issue is that these are all fairly long cooldowns. The 2 damage reductions are 3 minutes, and Exhilaration is a 2-minute cooldown. But again, they sort of hit this tanky enough line, right? They're not going to have a cooldown for everything that happens, but for the big events, they'll have a cooldown for it, and they'll just be able to take pressure off their healers. All, of course, though, while having the benefit of being a range spec. So it's not like they're going to ever really be at risk of getting hit by frontals or, being hit by some of the abilities that just hit the closest target, right? Marksmanship Hunter gets to sit very far away, gets to be very safe. So they don't necessarily need to have as many defensive cooldowns as some of the other specs. So moving on to the next spec is going to be, I think, Windwalker Monk will get played. And this is also probably not super surprising. Windwalker is another spec that is really kind of overperforming at the moment. They do have the downside of being melee, which is a legitimate downside right now. There's a lot of stuff that really fucks with melee. But they do well above average damage. And one of the main things is that they do well above average damage for what I essentially consider to be a support spec. I don't think Windwalker is not, your big, huge damage carry, but they just do really strong, consistent damage, and they have really unique utility that makes them sort of invaluable, especially in an MDI setting. So one of the things that really makes them valuable is they have a lot of DPS cooldowns to rotate. Storm, Earth, and Fire, the kind of pink purplish icon, is a minute and a half recharge, but they have 2 cooldowns or 2 uses of it, so they can sort of cycle this on top of each other. And then they also have Invoke, I believe it's Invoke Zwen is how it's pronounced, the Tiger Celestial, which is a 2-minute cooldown, which is also a pretty significant damage cooldown, which increases their AoE throughput by a decent amount because Zwen just hits multiple things. And on top of that, it's sort of underrated, but they have Touch of Death. And Touch of Death actually solves a lot of problems in Shadowlands dungeons, especially at the moment, where Touch of Death on Prideful is quite valuable because the last 15% of Prideful's health is a little bit scary because DPS don't want to really be popping cooldowns at the end of Prideful's life, because you're not going to get that much out of it, right? The Prideful's not going to be alive for that long, but the end of Prideful is when it's going to have the most stacks, and your healer is going to be the most taxed. And especially if you are pulling trash with Prideful, or you're pulling Prideful onto a boss or something, that's when it's really going to be the scariest. And Touch of Death to very quickly execute Prideful in that last 15% is quite valuable. But even beyond that, there's a lot of ads and boss fights that actually Touch of Death is quite useful on. The boss that throws 2 DPS players down into the arena in Theater of Pain, executing his banners is really useful. The end boss of the other side, Mwizala, executing your totem, or executing your little ad that you have to kill when you guys split up, is also extremely useful. I'm trying to think what else. In Plaguefall, the bombs that Dr. Ickis summons, you can execute those as well. You can also execute the mobs on Margrave Strada, the last boss in Plaguefall. There's just a lot of things that Touch of Death actually sort of solves, right? There's a lot of things that are up that you need to kill that you can just Touch of Death them and very quickly kill them. And it just doesn't cost your other DPS players any of their cooldowns. One of the main upsides of having a monk of the group is you sort of have just like infinite mob control. Leg sweep for an AoE stun to just hold everything in place, to let your hunter with their wild spirits, with their volley, just do tons of damage in AoE is super valuable. Ring of Peace can also hold things in the same area. It can be used as a, knock something out of Sanguine. It can be used to prevent casts. It does sort of everything. And Paralyze is essentially a single target stun that can interrupt some casts. It's a range interrupt if you want to look at it like that. It sort of does a lot of things. It can also be used to just lock a mob out of a pull and pull it in later once things are less scary. There's just a lot you can do as a monk for mob control. One of the criticisms that Windwalker Monk has also received a lot is that they're kind of squishy, but currently in Shadowlands, they actually have a ton of defensive cooldowns to rotate. They have Fortifying Brew, which is new to their kit, which is a 15% health increase, 15% damage reduction, and if you also spec into the conduit for it, it gives you a shield for about 15% of your health, maybe like 18% at like a 213 eye level on the conduit. But it basically makes it that you have to take 160% of your health in damage to die. It's a very powerful defensive cooldown. It is a 3-minute CD, but they also have Touch of Karma on a 1.5-minute cooldown, which is a 50% max health shield. And they also have a talent choice between either like a physical damage reduction or a magic damage reduction. So they have 3 separate defensive cooldowns that they can be rotating through for whatever is hitting them. And there's also some weird stuff you can do, like with Touch of Karma. I know can be used rotationally. Use hit Touch of Karma, taunt a mob off the tank, right? So the tank takes less damage. You absorb with the shield, and then Touch of Karma does damage to that mob. There's some weird stuff like that. But even if you're doing that as like a rotational thing, you still have 2 defensive cooldowns you can be rotating. So Windwalker is actually quite tanky relative to other melee specs at the moment. So one of the big things, though, is that Windwalker plays really nice with the meta healer specs, and it's mostly in their Dispel. They have a Disease and Poison Dispel, which neither of the, quote, Resto specs do. So Restoration Druid and Restoration Shaman do not have Disease or Poison Dispels. Resto Druid has Poison, or shoot, I just don't remember. But both of the Resto specs, Windwalker covers the dispels that they do not have, which is very valuable. Especially in Plaguefall, there's actually a lot of diseases that can be dispelled, which are quite useful to be dispelled. And they also have Tiger's Lust. Tiger's Lust is sort of underrated, but like in Plaguefall, there's like roots that go out on second boss and Halls of Atonement when the curses go out, right? You can really only decurse like one person, and you can Tiger's Lust another one, and they get rid of the slow. They're still going to get frozen in stone, but they get rid of the slow, and they can keep running around and be free to get out of the jump, right? So there's just a lot of things that Windwalker can do to actually support the other members of the group, right? They pop DPS cooldowns because they're really short cooldowns in some of them, or they can cycle like Storm, Earth, and Fire to prevent other DPS players from having to pop their cooldowns. They have so much mob control to let other people just do their jobs, and they can help out the healer with some, pretty unique utility, which is really nice. So I think the third and final DPS spec for the MDI this season is going to be Fire Mage. And this is a little weird because both the previous specs that have discussed Hunters and Windwalkers have been played in the MDI quite significantly before, right? And Vengeance Demon Hunter was sort of fringe meta, but it's received buffs in defensive uptimes to fix the issues it had before, as well as it's just sort of overperforming spec at the moment. But mages have haven't really been popular pretty much all throughout BFA. I believe Dr. J played Mage a couple of times, but that's about it. So Fire Mage is a new one. And really, I think you're going to play Fire Mage because of the absolutely absurd damage in large pulls. Because both Windwalkers, Marksman Hunters, and the Vengeance Demon Hunters are target capped at about 5 to 6 targets, depending on the spell, right? But Fire Mage is not completely uncapped, but they really, really, truly excel in large AoE pulls. And the MDI is going to feature plenty of those. Even though target caps are in place, I do not anticipate the MDI is going to slow down in terms of pull size. The MDI is still going to pull very large because it is still the most efficient way to be killing the dungeon quickly, right? And I mean, we've seen mages doing absurd damage, right? Mages are breaking 75k DPS and live keys. They are just annihilating packs, right? And they're annihilating packs in, plus 19, plus 20, plus 21 keys, right? Stuff that I don't anticipate we'll see in the MDI. I think we're going to see a lot lower key levels. But one of the nice things now is that, damage is being their primary strength, but Night Fae puts them on a roughly 1 minute cooldown, and it is not reliant on mob health this time to reduce the cooldown of their combust, which combust is the primary ability that you're talking about, right? Where shifting power for Night Fae just reduces their cooldowns while it's going, right? Things don't necessarily have to be alive. So Fire Mage has a lot higher uptime on combust than they have in the past. Obviously, the end of BFA was sort of a different thing with the Minute Mage build, but that was also to do with, what is it called? With Azurite essences, So now shifting power puts them on a very short cooldown, and their DPS in that burst window of combust is absolutely absurd. So, and they still bring solid mob control, but I just want to add on to the damage factor real quick is they have the Hunters and Windwalkers to kind of carry them through these gaps in damage. And Fire Mage, when you pull the large packs or on the bosses, right, are really going to be able to dump damage. And now that they also have like sort of separate rotations for AoE damage and for single target damage, Fire Mages are still going to speed up your boss kills quite a lot if they get, that second combust up on a boss, or, if you're just killing a boss by itself because there's no other trash with it, right? Or, when you pull these large packs, Fire Mage is just going to be able to obliterate everything. And I actually think that Fire Mage damage is really going to be the carry for a lot of these keys. So, anyways, but they still bring solid mob control. Dragon's Breath, the AoE disorient to sort of interrupt a lot of casts is really handy. Frost Nova to just root everything near the mage is really handy for kiting, as well as for stuff like Spiteful. They can talent into Ring of Frost, or they can have 2 Frost Novas. But Ring of Frost for stuff like the slimes, the small slimes on first boss and Plaguefall, to just stop them from reaching the boss and, buffing his health, is really valuable. Also just for kiting some different mobs, like the Gargons and Halls of Atonement, for example. Ring of Frost can be quite valuable. It is actually absurdly hard to die as Fire Mage right now. You have an immunity in Ice Block. You have a Cheat Death and Cauterize. You have a shield, a self shield, and Blazing Barrier. You have Mirror Images, which is a damage reduction, as well as like an aggro fade. And I actually don't have the icon up for it here, but you also have Alter Time, which you hit before a damage event, and then 10 seconds later you get jumped back up to whatever health you're at, right? So you can get jumped up to full health again. Fire Mage has so many defensive cooldowns. It is actually unreal. Even if they make mistakes, right, they have Cauterize as a cheat death to keep them alive. Fire Mage is like crazy hard to die on right now. And that's going to be really nice for the MDI because you can just sort of fix mistakes, right? Just by being Fire Mage. If you make a mistake, you take some damage that you maybe shouldn't have, and it's going to take a lot of pressure off the healer, just how many defensive cooldowns they have. So, other potential DPS specs that we could see Balance Druid for sure. They also have really strong burst damage and they have really strong utility. The reason I don't think we'll see them is that their cooldowns are longer than other specs. Convoke as a 2-minute is sort of fine, but Celestial Alignment on a 3-minute cooldown, it's just a little longer than the other specs, especially since you're trying to hold Convoke for Celestial Alignment. So you're really only looking at burst damage every 3 minutes, which is just not really what you want for the MDI. You sort of want shorter cooldowns on your damage. Outlaw Rogue is another really popular MDI spec in the past. It's a total Swiss Army knife spec. It has a lot of the utility that the Hunters have. But the issue is it's a little bit low on damage at the moment. They definitely do good damage, but it's a little low on damage at the moment. And the utility is largely covered by the Hunters and the Windwalkers as well. But one of the big things is that Shroud of Concealment is no longer as valuable, like we talked about at the start of the video. You just don't need the invis skip as much, but also the Hunter can spec into invis. The Mage has invisibility. Everyone's going to be Night Elf. All of these specs can play Night Elf. So Night Elf obviously gives you the Shadow Meld already, so you don't need Shroud as much. And also, again, like we talked about, Invis Pot sharing the same cooldown with everything else means that you're less punished for using an invisibility potion as compared to using, or you're not missing out on as many damage potions, sorry. As well as there's the Engineering Invisibility Belt, which is kind of nice, right? But it's not super reliable, but it exists. So the main draws of Rogue, I think, are not really there, and they're just a little short on damage, unfortunately. Another really popular MDI spec throughout BFA was Unholy Death Knight. They really excel at the big pulls, and they still do. It could very well slot in to replace Fire Mage. It totally could. I could very much see a world where MDI teams decide that they want to play Unholy instead of Fire Mage, because I think a lot of the MDI DPS have played Unholy in an MDI setting before, and they might be very comfortable with it, as opposed to Fire Mage, which they might not have played. Really, the reason I chose Mage over Death Knight is that I think Mage is harder to die on right now. One, because it's range, but two, because it has so many defensive cooldowns, where Unholy Death Knight really only has a couple. The one thing I will say, though, is that AMC is super unique DPS utility on like the last boss of Plaguefall, when the Infectious Rain is coming down, on like the third boss of Sanguine Depths, when you have to go pick up the orbs, dropping AMZ and letting everyone stand at it to reduce damage taken could be extremely valuable in a lot of those situations, actually. It could really take a lot of pressure off your healer, especially if you're playing, a healer that doesn't have, the AoE damage reduction, or just adding another AoE damage reduction to the group, right? It's very unique utility that can definitely get a lot of value in the right situation, though. So definitely keep that in mind if they do see Unholy Death Knights, is look for how they're using AMZ. So, moving on to healers. The biggest question, in my opinion, is what heal spec you're going to play. And ultimately, it's going to depend on the keystone level. The higher keystone level we go, the more likely it's going to be Resto Shaman, because I think Resto Shaman is the obvious answer that everyone is going to assume, and that's because live keys are absolutely dominated by Resto Shamans. 39% of plus 20 and higher keys, so basically 2 out of 5 plus 20 and higher keys is done by a Resto Shaman currently. It's ridiculous. But it makes perfect sense. They have really strong throughput. They just have cooldowns for everything, So the higher the key level goes, the more likely Resto Shaman will be picked. And at the moment, as of recording this, I do not know what key level the MDI will be at, right, when it goes live. I don't know if it's going to be like plus 16s, which is on the lower end. I don't know if it's going to be like plus 19s, plus 20s, which should be on the higher end. So this is a big question mark in my mind. One of the main benefits to the Resto Shaman is they can flex between Necrolord and Venthyr, because out of all of the specs that we've talked about so far, right, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Windwalker are both Kyrian. The Hunter and the Mages are both Night Fae. So Resto Shaman can play both Necrolord and Venthyr, and the ability actually works very well for them. So that's really important for, all the dungeons that you want a Necrolord and Venthyr player. But the issue is that they just do a little bit less damage than the other healers. They actually probably do about the same damage as Mistweaver, to be honest, but all the other heal specs that are actually serious contenders, Resto Druid, Disc Priest, Holy Paladin, they just do a little bit less damage then. They have a ton of cooldowns. They can really deal with a lot of situations. But again, it really comes back down to damage. And the other kind of damning factor is they can't be Night Elf. So if the MDI ends up really looking at using Night Elf skips, then Resto Shaman's sort of out. In the same way that Holy Paladin was sort of out because it couldn't be Night Elf, right? So, but if the keystone level is low enough, and by low enough, I mean like 17s, because every healer spec has timed plus 20 and higher keys. It's totally doable. They can more than heal, 17s, 18s, even in big pulls, right? They'd be able to heal 16s, 17s, other healers would. So at that point, we start looking at healers for their damage output, right? I'll clear this up real quick, though. It won't be Mistweaver, because you'll want to play a Windwalker Monk, and also because Mistweaver's Their Chi-Ji, their Crane, doesn't work the same as it did in BFA. It's now a 3-minute cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown. So the amount of pulls that you can use it for is just a lot lower, as well as it's not quite as strong as it was before. Even though I play Mistweaver and I really like Mistweaver, you won't see Mistweaver in the MDI. Yeah, you just won't. I think Resto Druid is a very strong candidate for the MDI healer. And like we talked about at the start of this video, damage is king, but 2 AoE damage is king. And Sunfire is an absurd spell for once everything grouped up. 1 global, put a dot on everything in the pull, and it hits quite hard, actually. So Sunfire into Resto Druid spam healing your tank, and the Resto Druid is still going to contribute more damage than a Resto Shaman would in a big pull, right? As well as Resto Druid has the benefit of they still get to play Druid and they still get to play Convoke. And with Heart of the Wild, Convoke in Moonkin form, Resto Druid does big damage, both on single target and on AoE. It's a relatively long cooldown on Heart of the Wild for sure. It's a 5-minute cooldown, but Convoke is only a 2-minute cooldown. And coming from a healer, I don't think you're going to see the same damage out of any heal spec compared to a Resto Druid in Convoke, right? So Resto Druid really makes these big pulls easier because they can just hot up the tank, right? Give them all the hots going into the pull, swap into Moonkin form, Convoke Heart of the Wild, do really big damage, and as the tank needs more healing, when they're defensives and the hots start running out, they just swap out, and they've already contributed their big damage for the pull. Resto Druid can also be... The issue with Resto Druid is they also want to be Night Fae, which means that for 4 dungeons, that would leave your group without a Necrolord or a Venthyr. So in those dungeons, which is Theater of Pain, Plaguefall, Halls of Atonement, and Spires, Sanguine Depths, it's entirely possible you see Resto Shamans come in because they can play Necrolord and Venthyr. Maybe not in the Necrolord dungeons because the Windwalker can play Necrolord, and Necrolord for Windwalker in pure AoE situations is quite strong. So you could see the Windwalker play Necrolord for those and see a Resto Druid still in the Necrolord dungeons just for their big damage. And also Resto Druids have the lowest cooldown on an external. Disc Priest is a 3-minute cooldown. Holy Paladin is a 2-minute cooldown. Resto Shaman, of course, does not have an external. And just that extra defensive for your tank in these really big pulls is actually a legitimate benefit. And I just want to talk about Holy Paladin a little bit. I think Holy Paladin, they have absolutely absurd single target damage for a healer while still contributing healing to the group. The issue with Holy Paladin is they have to be Kyrian, right? So again, you run into a similar situation where you don't have a Necrolord or a Venthyr in the group. And the other issue with Holy Paladin is they can't be Night Elf, which means they can't do skips, which is a legitimate downside. And also, Holy Paladins can do really good damage, but they have to contribute their healing cooldowns to doing so. And in these really large pulls, I'm not convinced that Holy Paladin will be able to commit a lot of their Holy Power or their cooldowns to doing damage. So I think they're going to have to commit a lot of their cooldowns to their Holy Power to healing the tank through all the damage that you're going to be taking these really large pulls, where like Resto Druid just drops Sunfire and sort of moves on, or drops Convoke and sort of moves on and keeps healing, but they've contributed their big damage, right? And then the last spec we haven't really talked about is Disc Priest. I don't think you'll see Disc Priest because once a Disc Priest falls behind, which is entirely possible in these MDI keys, they spend the entire time Shadow Mend spamming. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. And they can just fall behind very easily, and once they're behind, they do 0 damage, and they don't even do as much healing as like a Resto Shaman would, right? So I really think that the things you're going to be looking at are potentially for a dungeon, if it's like a tyrannical Theater of Pain, you might see Holy Paladin come in with the 5 bosses of that dungeon, which are largely single target damage, right? As well as some of the large mobs in the challengers area of that dungeon, which are just pure single target. I think Holy Paladin could be quite strong just for its single target damage while also healing. But for everything else, I think Resto Druid has a very strong chance to edge out Resto Shaman in a lot of these dungeons just for its AoE damage while still being able to more than competently heal the incoming damage to the group. So I know this was a long video. It's a lot longer than probably a lot of people would watch, but I do thank you all for watching. And I will see you all in about a week and a half once the MDI Cup one is over. We'll sort of see what happens, but I plan on making some more content around the MDI, just sort of for fun. So GG's everyone. Thanks for watching.